Welcome everyone to this second talk of the sixth edition of the Legacy of Socrates. I am very excited because I am having Andrea Goulet here, and it has been a long time actually, sixth edition, and she was not here yet. So I'm happy she's here now. If you don't know Andrea, well, if you know the Legacy Code Rocks podcast and community, well, basically she founded it. So if you are here listening to the podcast, you know that, and you have hear her. She did a lot of. She's a speaker, and she talked worldwide of a lot of topics. What I really like is that she has a unique perspective on legacy code bases and how to approach code. And this is what we're gonna do today. I also forgot to mention, she founded Corgi Bytes, and nowadays she's working on a new book, which is not published yet, but soon will be. And you can find more information on empathyintech.com. I will put the link in the chat. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We never talk really about empathy as a technical skill. And Andrea is going to tell you more about that. And I think it's a very important topic. So without further ado, Andrea, you're up.
Awesome. All right. Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to be here. I really like geeking out about legacy code. And one of the things that I think is so critical about legacy code is empathy. I'll go into a little bit of my story. But yeah, I've been working on legacy code for about 12 years, but my background is as a copywriter. So when I heard the joke that, there are two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors, I was like, naming things is hard? Like, I understand that part. And so over the years, kind of honing in on this tiny little thing where I know, and then helping developers develop this as a very technical skill. So I'm glad to be here. So I'm actually going to start with a little bit of kind of how I got into software. So, about 12 years ago, a good friend of mine from high school approached me at our high school reunion and said, I've been reading your blog. The way that you approach communication is programmatic. You're a programmer. I was like, what? I have never opened the command line. I've always worked on a Mac. When I was a kid, they didn't have the command line on there. I'm not a programmer. He goes, no. I really want to do legacy code for a living. This is Scott. So if you've listened to the podcast, my counterpart. And he's like, I want to do legacy code for a living, and I can't at my current job. So I want to build a company, and you know how to run a business. So come be my CDO. And so I was like, okay. After a few months of negotiation and trying to figure out if this was really for me, I did, and had a good time. And then I went to my very first software conference, and let me make sure I'm in the right window. There we go. And I was a little taken aback at what I had signed up for because I didn't see anybody who looked like me in the audience. It was about 400 people, and I was one of maybe 4 women. And I was like, well, at least the line to the bathroom will be short for the first time ever. And so then it was time for networking. And so I would approach a group that kind of looked like this, and I would be like, come on, Andrea, you've been in sales your whole life. You know how to talk to people. You don't need to be intimidated. And I would say, hi, I'm Andrea. And then, after a little bit of chatter, I would usually about 40% of the time have somebody who looked at me like this and then asked, are you technical or non-technical? And I would then look back at them like this, and I would think in my head, so am I technical? Okay, well, I'm the CEO of a software company, and my business partner told me that I'm a good programmer, and I know I'm really good at pattern spotting. I have pretty strong logical reasoning skills. And you know what? Last year, I even submitted a pull request to a major open source project, and it was merged. And I've been pairing on production code for 2 years. I don't know. Does that count? Let's see here. Non-technical. Well, my background is in marketing and sales and copywriting. That's not really technical. And the command line feels really scary. I really like using graphical user interfaces, even when I merge code. You know what? And I was told that when I was feeling really comfortable with HTML and CSS, somebody told me that's not actually programming because it's just declarative languages. I didn't get any degrees. I haven't attended any workshops. Everything I've done is self-taught, and I still get tripped up on jargon. Like, what's the difference between a property and an attribute? Ugh. And I look and I think differently. And I don't really ever code by myself. I almost always pair. So I'm non-technical. And so then a few years later, so by this time we had been running the business together for 5 years, and Scott and I had since gotten married. And we were on our very first podcast. Legacy Code Rocks hadn't started yet. And it was a big deal. We were really excited that we had booked, somebody wanted to interview us. And so Scott was speaking, and then he gets to our origin story. It was like, how did you get into Legacy Code? And so he tells the story of how we met up at our high school reunion. And then he says, Andrea is our non-technical founder. She's brilliant with sales and marketing. So at the end of the podcast, I sat there and then I looked at him like this and I said, not technical? What? I don't understand. How could you say that? I've been coding next to you for years. And then he said something that was really profound. Scott is very calm and just listens and great partner. And he said, it's how you introduce yourself all the time. When I recorded that podcast, we literally had a sales meeting right before with a prospect. And those are the words that you said to introduce yourself. So when you call yourself technical, so will I. Then I had an identity crisis where it was like, why do I think that I'm not technical? Where did this come from? What do you have to be technical? And just really started doing a whole lot of exploration. And what would it mean? What would I need to do to call myself technical? So I started asking around, and kind of part of this journey was asking Scott, hey Scott, when you go to conferences, do people ever ask you if you're technical? And he thought really hard and he was like, actually no, but I actually ask that question to other people all the time. Oh, really? So you ask everyone that you meet? And he thought, no, just some people, because, I want to be really nice. I don't want to bore people. Most people, when I'm out and about, when I start talking about computers, their eyes glaze over. So I don't want to bore anybody. I was like, so just the people who look like me? And he thought really hard and he's like, oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm a jerk. Oh my gosh. And then he would get this feeling and he would say, you know what? Machines are so easy. I run the test. I get a green or a red. I know if it passed or failed. People are hard. And I've been asking this question to people for years and I never got any feedback. People are just so messy. And Scott was doing on the other side of that divide, where he was so technical, but then he internalized this feeling of, I'm bad with people. And we've really gotten to that point, I think, in the software industry, which I don't typically see in other industries, having come from, not a traditional software background. So at this point, I just want to kind of pause and send some compassion first of all, for Scott, who graciously allowed me to share this very vulnerable story, but also for anybody in the audience where this story resonates, right? Because I've talked to hundreds of developers through the podcast, through all the conferences I've spoken at. And if you do find yourself tripping up, it's okay, right? That's part of this process. So if people have seen the movie Indiana Jones, there's this great scene. And if you haven't, it's okay, I'll walk you through. So Indiana Jones is standing on the edge of this chasm, right? And his father is in the background and he's dying of a gunshot wound and he needs to find the Holy Grail because that's got the special powers that will save his father. And so his father, he gets this message of that he has to leap from the lion's head, and the lion's head is right there. He's like, leap, that's impossible. Nobody can jump this. And that was how I felt when I was trying to cross over into the world of being able to call myself technical. So I was able to identify with how Scott was feeling, with this feeling of like, I'll never be good with people. So that's Indiana Jones, Representative Scott. And then I'm over on the other side and say, no, like what you're doing, this question of technical or non-technical, like there's actually a really easy fix. It's a communication pattern. If you're using a close-ended question like, are you technical or non-technical, that inherently introduces more bias. And you use that when you want to confirm a bias. But if you're using an open-ended question, then that doesn't introduce bias. So if you swapped the opening question with what brings you here, chances are somebody would, provide the context of why they're there, and then you could assess on a more nuanced level of where to take the conversation. And I was like, because I took training, I was a copywriter for 10 years. My job was to learn all of these different communication patterns. And a lot of them are just, once you identify the pattern, it's, the same as code. I said, don't feel bad if you don't know them because they're totally not obvious. I spent a decade really deep in understanding this training, and you didn't get the same training as I did because you were studying computers. And you know what? Come on over. There's tons of communication frameworks and patterns that I can teach you. And they're really useful while you code because I've been coding next to you. And I actually implement these a lot, especially in naming and commit messages and pull requests and all the different places where you use natural language while you code. And then Scott was like, come on over. Where's the bridge? Like, so feeling like Indiana Jones, where it's like, how do I leap over this chasm? And it does require a leap of faith, right? Because we've internalized these identities of being technical or non-technical. And so it requires a leap of faith that even though you've been told that you're not good with computers your whole life, you can learn how to code. Or even though you've been told your whole life that you're not good with people and you're good with machines and you should stay over here in your lane, like you can do this and you can learn. Because the truth is that there is an invisible bridge. So in the movie, Indiana Jones takes his foot and he lifts it up and then he thinks he's going to fall to his death. But what happens is he sees a bridge and it was just hidden because of the perspective. So if we're only looking straight forward, we won't see the bridge. But if we move just a little bit and shift our perspective, we can see that the divide between hard skills and soft skills or technical and non-technical, that is all an illusion. And we can walk between these worlds as often as we want and as often as we need to. Because when you think about it, all code is communication. You don't code to make the compiler happy. You code through a computer for other people. The computer is a tool that you are using to communicate through code. And just like software is built on binary ones and zeros, effective communication is built on empathy. And empathy at its essence is understanding people using both logic and emotion. People tend to think that it's this like intuitive feeling, and we'll get to kind of the nuances of how we got there. But that's actually not empathy. Empathy isn't telepathy. Empathy actually requires a whole lot of analytical thinking. There's actually a whole group of different kinds of empathy. So here are kind of the three main ones. So the first one is cognitive empathy. And this is what I used a whole lot in marketing and in writing marketing pieces. And cognitive empathy is being able to understand on a very intellectual level what other people feel. A lot of times it's using data, it's watching lots of different interviews and spotting patterns. It's an incredibly rational and analytical process. Another type of empathy is the emotional empathy. And this tends to be the type of empathy that people think when they think general empathy. And it's, what I felt when I saw that Scott was struggling with this idea of, I'm bad with people. I was like, oh, I remember what that felt like when I had my identity crisis and I was trying to learn how to become technical. Like I can take my emotion and I can try to understand how you're feeling through my experience and through my feeling. And then you have empathetic concern, which is sometimes also known as compassion. And that is taking empathy and putting action to it. So it's like, I want to help. I want, like, I just, empathy is understanding how somebody feels. Compassion is wanting to act on that and actively relieve suffering. You also have subcategories. There's actually a whole bunch more. I only picked 3 here. You have self empathy. So, like, when you're struggling, you need to send that compassion and empathy back to yourself. It's really, really important and also really hard because we're trained in the world to not do that. Mirrored empathy. And so this is kind of the physiological side where we see like our brain like mimics other people. And so for me, this shows up when I go and speak in Amsterdam or in France or, somewhere where the accent is different. I come back home and people say, you're starting to speak in a little bit of a French accent. Like my cadence will just switch a little bit. And that's mirrored empathy. It's not something I'm doing consciously, but my brain is picking up on the, different speech patterns and trying to mimic and be more like them. Because we're social creatures. We are wired to connect. We are wired to work together as groups. There's also personal distress. This shows up for me when I'm watching like a blooper reel or a scary movie. And again, this is more physiological, where it's like somebody falls off a motorcycle and then you like have a pang of like, oh my gosh, I imagine what it feels like. But it's not cognitive. It's not like I'm thinking it. It's like I experience it for a brief moment. And with mirrored empathy and personal distress, like some people are more sensitive, right? So there is a degree of kind of I'm more sensitive to being able to pick up on these cues than maybe other people. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you're exempt or can't develop some of these other skills. So really quickly, kind of empathy clarified, right? So empathy is not character-based. You're not born with a certain degree of empathy or not. Empathy is something that is learned, similar to language, where nearly everyone has the capacity to learn language and you develop it through your environment, right? And you can pick up skills, right? Some people might, be able to pick it up a little bit easier, but for the most part, we just kind of learn about it by navigating the world. It's not sympathy or pity. Sympathy is just noticing that someone is sad and like having like, oh, I care about that person being sad. Pity is just recognizing that there is suffering. And usually pity comes with kind of an overtone of being paternalistic or feeling like, oh, isn't that sad that, that person. Like we said, it's not telepathy. It's not simple. Like there's a whole lot here, which is why I'm convinced it's a technical skill because I've been studying this deeply for 5-6 years now. And I always keep learning more. It's not passive, and it's also not permission, right? You're not giving people permission to act a certain way or treat you a certain way. I don't go into it a lot in this talk, but empathy and boundaries actually have a really important connection to each other. Some things that kind of empathy is, but kind of not. It's not a feeling, just a feeling. It's not walking in someone else's shoes either. That's from a poem from the 1800s, and people tend to think of that. But you're never going to actually be able to fully walk in someone's shoes. You can best walk beside them and say, hey, here's my experience. Is that similar to what you're feeling? But you can never reconstruct someone else's entire life perspective. And pretending that you can actually introduces a whole host of problems. It's not something you're born with, and it's not intuition. Empathy is a skill that you can grow with practice. Just like you learned how to code. Whenever I do this in person, I say, who knew how to code in JavaScript out of the womb? I always get 1 or 2 people who try to be funny and raise their hands, which is awesome. It's also data driven. So, if you're constantly validating, hey, is this how you feel? Am I accurate? Like there's a whole lot of processing that needs to come in, and that data needs to be quality because same as code, garbage in, garbage out. It's both rational and emotional, it's complex, and it's active. It's something that you practice every day. Empathy can also go really wrong, right? So I used to, I call this empathy confetti, and I see this a lot now where it's like, empathy is amazing. Everybody should do empathy, 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 empathy. And that's great. I was 100% there. And then it's like, oh, I learned how empathy actually can be destructive if it's not used in the right way. So, for example, if you have lots and lots of cognitive empathy, and so you understand how people will react, but you don't care about their feelings, that's manipulation, right? And so those are scams, or worse. If you have lots of empathetic concern and lots of compassion, but you're not applying rational thought to this, you actually have potential ethics problems because you can be so moved by one person's story that you forget about the impact of the entire group, right? And so this is where it's like we need to be cautious and look at things in multiple perspectives so that we can be judicious in our actions. And then finally, if you have lots of emotional empathy for other people, but you're not including yourself, then you can be a doormat and your needs are just trampled. And I was in this bucket for a long time. So recovering, recovering doormat right here. So I like to think of empathy kind of like a mixing board, right? Where you have to regulate it contextually and constantly think, what situation am I in and what kind of empathy do I need? Right. So if I'm sitting there focused on kind of some really cognitive empathy, like, ooh, okay, I'm in marketing, like this, I know that this will work. Let me take a moment and like, if I was this person, how would I feel? Right. So not just thinking about what would they do, but like connecting to that emotion. Or on the flip side, wow, I'm really moved by this. Let me put in some empathetic concern. Let me check and see where this story came from. Let me see if this research backs it up, right? So you're constantly moving up or down, and it's a skill that you learn, kind of like driving a car. Like at the beginning, it's like there's okay, I've got to look at the wheel, I've got to look at this, I've got to look at that. But over time, this becomes more intuitive. So one way you're like, wait a second, what? Where did that come from? So this one way is, and kind of the thing that I've been really interested in is how can we map empathy to existing computer science metaphors so that we can anchor and have better conversations about how to implement empathy. So just this is a von Neumann architecture for computers. And I think that we can use this as a way to identify some empathy architecture so that we can think about this kind of as a whole, similar to how we think about a computer and how it's constructed kind of as a whole thing, but then you can dive really deep on each component. So instead of having input and output devices, we can think about these as communication signals from others and to others. And so these are nonverbal and verbal communication. So, we're tone of voice or the words that I'm saying, the meaning of the words that I'm saying, the gestures, all sorts of different things. Next, instead of the CPU, we have our brain, right? And instead of the control unit and the logic unit, right, the emotional empathy is kind of like the control unit, and the cognitive empathy is like our logic unit, right? And they both work together. You can't have just one. And then we have our stored memory. And to me, I've used the term communication artifacts. And what I see this as is durable and referenceable artifacts of your thinking. So then that way you can go back and you can say, what was it that I said? Because if you're just having a conversation around the water cooler, those are really ephemeral. And so that's more like RAM. And if you take the time and kind of write it down, or document it, then you can refer back to it if you need it. So similar to stored memory. And in software, we have a lot of these different communication artifacts, right? If you think about it, the reason that we code in compiled languages instead of ones and zeros is because as humans, it's easier. Computer doesn't care, right? We use don't repeat yourself, right? And we make sure that our code is intention revealing. We use retrospectives and we write in scenarios. We use loops. We specialize in our dev environments, making those fast, tests, whole lot of places that once you start to see it, it's like, oh, wow, there is a lot of empathy in software. And if we ignore it, we get a lot of problems. We start to get bias. Customers aren't as happy. We have less diversity, lower productivity. Release cycles take longer because we're not paying down that technical debt. And we get toxic cultures like that hero culture, lots of bugs because it's not worth fixing. Morale is low, silos, right? All this stuff. And so I'm convinced that if we start to really focus on empathy as a technical skill, just in the same way as we would, learning about test-driven development or behavior-driven development, or learning how to spot different patterns in your code, or how to architect your code so that it's, doing the thing you want, that we can really, really, really make a lot of progress in these areas. So once I kind of had validated that it wasn't just my experience, that this was something that kind of was universal, and regardless of what side of the chasm you were on, I started to get really curious about how did we get here? And so I'm going to dive into the history just a little bit, but it's been really fun digging into the bowels of the ACM for the past several months. And so I'm going to start with a quote by John Bacchus, who wrote this great essay called Programming in America in the 1950s. And John Bacchus, if you've heard of the Bacchus-Noor, he is responsible for that. He also was the main author for Fortran. He said, recognition in the small programming fraternity was more likely to be accorded for a colorful personality, an extraordinary feat of coding, or the ability to hold a lot of liquor well than it was for an intellectual insight. Ideas flowed freely along with the liquor at innumerable meetings, as well as in sober private discussions and informally distributed papers. An idea was the property of anyone who could use it, and the scholarly practice of noting references to sources in unrelated work was almost universally unknown or unpracticed. So if you were able to get in the room, and if you were able to be in that environment where you could use different ideas, awesome, right? But if you weren't, because at the time in the 1950s in America, we had segregation, right? You could legally not hire a woman simply because of her gender. Right? We had a lot of structural and legislative things that kept other people out from this room. And then a few years later, so this was in 1966, there was what's called the Cannon-Perry survey. So it was by William Cannon and Dallas Perry. And what they did was they surveyed about 1,400 people. There were about 180 women that took the survey as well. And they wanted to understand what made programmers satisfied, right? So they identified as programmers, and they didn't set aside these are the activities that a programmer does. They relied on programmers to self-identify. So that in itself is kind of a methodological flaw there. But after this survey, they came up with 3 things: that programmers are crazy about puzzles, they tend to like research and applications and risk taking, and they don't like people. And to me, in the research, I think this is the point where we start to see the branching of empathy and technical and non-technical skills. And this study actually has a lot of other implications too. If you read it, actually ranks the activities that developers do. And, scientific programmers, they did feature development, and those were more important. And guess what was at the bottom? Maintenance, right? So we start to see that bifurcation too, not just in, the attributes, but also in the value of programming activities. Other problems with this survey, so they separated people into business programmers and scientific programmers. And these illustrations, I think, also clearly note that women aren't participating in the coding, that they are more objects to be won if you are a certain type of programmer. And so they really differentiate between business programmers who come from business backgrounds, and they are doing banking, they're doing accounting systems, they're working with military, but they're putting processes into things that already exist. And then there are the scientific programmers who are modeling things like the weather, and they're the ones who are really desirable. But they don't code as much, right? So it's really interesting to see these, but it's like they have math. Like they're the ones that really that you want to be like. Another thing about this survey was that they said that if you are interested in sales, you should not even become a programmer. So it says, somebody who has a really high degree in business or sales should not have entered the programming field at all, not even business programming, but they should have remained a businessman. So me feeling like I'm really good at sales, I don't belong in programming, that was a seed that was sown 20 years before I was born, or longer than that. But like a lot of these things are really, really systemic, and they started a long time before. So they are very, very entrenched. Now, how did this study become so influential? Part of this had to do with the IBM PAT, which is the Programmer Aptitude Test. And this was developed by Walter McNamara in the 1950s, and then it was revised in 1967. And this was a 1-hour math test. And 80% of businesses at the time used aptitude tests for hiring decisions, and half of those used the PAT. And in 1967 alone, the PAT was administered to 700,000 people. And until the mid 1980s, and it was even used through the late 90s, it was considered the de facto gateway into programming. So if you didn't pass the PAT, then you weren't going to become a programmer. And IBM, what they did was they said, wow, this is actually really useful, these scientific and business programmers. And so Walter McNamara, in an internal memo to IBM, said, although the scores on this survey haven't actually shown a high relationship of success in programming, I think we should use them anyway. And I see a similar test for the different selection of individuals applying for different types of programming jobs. And so then what IBM did was they came up with a console operator test and a data analyst test and a systems administrator test. And so then we start to see all of these different roles get carved out in this industry, but the programmer, right, and a specific type of programmer is held as like, that's the one you really want to be. And if you're anything else, then you're not enough. All right, so we're gonna play a game, right? And of these studies I looked at, and there were a lot of spot the logical fallacies. So take a minute and think through. I know you haven't read the studies yet, but I've linked to them if you wanted to go check it out. But imagine in your head how many logical fallacies existed between these two papers and also the test. You got the number in your head? Okay. Did you guess at least 20? There were a lot of logical fallacies involved in these two surveys that then got imbued into pop culture. So we start to see Revenge of the Nerds, right? We start to see pop culture really, really picking up on these things. We see war games where it's like, that's somebody who's really adventurous, right? And they're more of this like hacker, they're the scientific programmer. We see Dilbert, who's represented as the, business programmer, and the out of touch boss who understands business, but really should never code. And Jamil Zaki, who is a empathy researcher out in Stanford, actually coined a term for this called the Roddenberry Effect, where if you're familiar with Star Trek Next Generation, there's two characters in there. There's Data, who is an android, who is really trying to understand human emotions. And his counterpart, Deanna Troi, who is a betazoid, and so a half betazoid. And so she is she's an empath and can walk into a situation and immediately feel all of the different energies that everyone else feels. And she's sometimes overwhelmed with other people's emotions. And we see this so much. I played with a doll in the early 90s called Teen Talk Barbie, and it said, math class is tough. Do you have a crush on anyone? Let's go shopping. So my grades in math fell because I had a toy, right? And it wasn't just one toy, it was all of these different impressions. So that is why we have these identities I'm not good with, I'm good with machines or I'm good with people. I'm technical. I'm not technical. And I'm here to tell you that you are not a stereotype. You can learn these things and you can be both. You can have both cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Because empathy is a skill, and just like coding is a skill, and you can develop empathy with practice. All right, so I'm going to go over some kind of concrete ways and concrete things that you can do. I'm going to go through this relatively fast because I want to make sure that we've got time for questions. But you can think of the activities that I would encourage you to invest in, kind of like a pyramid. And this doesn't mean to not do things at the top or, in the middle. Like, that's fine but if you're going to start somewhere, try to think about making sure that you've got a really good empathy mindset first. Then once you've got that, it'll be easier to clear your lens. Once you've got your lens cleared, you can point your perspective. So it just becomes easier as you've got some of these more foundational skills. So the first is developing an empathy mindset. And this is just recognizing that empathy is a valid skill and that you have the capacity to learn it. And it's learning about empathy just like you would any other programming concept. It's rejecting these false dichotomies that delegitimize empathy. And it's learning to treat computers as tools, not people. Starting to really think about, oh, I'm coding for someone else. One of the suggestions I make here is if you ever catch yourself going, oh, who would read this? Turn that tone from contempt into curiosity. So say the same thing, but just in a different mindset. Go, who's going to read this, right? If you're writing a commit message or an alt tag or something like that, just genuinely think about the person that will interact with that in the future. Next is clearing your lens, right? And this is about judgments and biases. Like, it's learning about, like, wow, all of these things that I believe about myself were architected based on faulty information. Right? And it's learning about the biases that you have, the assumptions that you have, how your own experiences influence how you see the world. And, biases aren't bad. Everyone has them. We as humans use shortcuts to navigate the world and to put ourselves into, like, should I go there or should I go there? But if we don't understand them, that's when they become a problem. It's evaluating your information sources, practicing listening to other people without injecting your own feelings. Like, this is called active listening sometimes. And then noticing any unhelpful behaviors and course correcting quickly. So in the process of this, somebody told me, like, well, just like you say non-technical and that hurt you, every time I hear the words, I'm going to have a higher level conversation. Meaning, like, I'm going to have a bigger picture. And then it's like, well, that makes me feel like the work that I'm doing isn't important. And so I'm doing the same thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for telling me. I do that very unconsciously. That's just kind of how I picked it up. I do not mean in any way to hurt your feelings, but thank you for telling me. So now I understand. And when we build that trust and we build that empathy with each other, then we can start to work together better. Next is pointing your perspectives. And this is recognizing, who are you having empathy for? You want to have empathy for an individual, not groups. Because if you develop empathy for a group, you actually entrench biases. And again, that's a way that empathy can go wrong. You want to recognize the impact of data types. So if you're only using demographics, that can, again, entrench stereotypes and it reduces empathy. So this kind of goes to the open-ended, closed-ended. Like, demographics tend to be things that fit really nicely into a spreadsheet. So we use them a lot in data science. Qualitative data tends to be a little bit harder to get, but it's that open-ended question. We're letting people describe their experiences, and then we're coding based on patterns. But that's letting other people define their own thinking style, define what they need. But if we're injecting our own biases and saying, do you want this or this? We're not going to get the richness of the information. You want to also think about more than one audience, right? So if we go back to commit messages, right, you've got your future self who might need to refer back to something. You've got, you're leaving it for other people who might go fix a bug later. Commit messages can also be really useful for legal defense, right? So, thinking about that, like, oh, I never thought of that, right? So, like, okay, if this was held up in court and, I wanted to put a description of, like, what I tried but was told not to do or whatever it is, right? You can put that in there. And also proactively seeking understanding, not just letting other people like tell you things, but actually going out and seeking that information. Communicating. So this is discovering where you can leave your artifacts and how you can make this really good for other people to find, like taking the time to, refactor a method so that it's really easy. And sometimes you can't do this. You can't do everything, right? But learning to prioritize and do what you can where you can. Seeking semantic alignment. So this is that like non-technical, oh, that really stings, or, high level conversation. Oh, that really stings. Or one that Scott and I had for years was this idea of fail fast, right? When I was trying to understand Agile, I was like, I don't want to fail. I want to create a successful business. And it took us about 8 years until we realized that Scott, when he was talking about fail fast, he was talking about a short term, like a week. I want to discover a mistake really quickly. But I was thinking about the long term. I wasn't thinking about immediate. And so we were using the same word, but we were meaning different things. And that's what semantics is. And this is a huge concept in domain-driven design in creating a ubiquitous language. Evaluating your different channels. So, your content, your style, your structure, and then taking a pause before delivering. So before you send that email, before you submit that pull request, before you write a code review, taking the time to just read over and think about, okay, if I was somebody else, how would I take this? Sometimes, oh, maybe I'll put a link, or maybe I'll attach that file, right? And that can really help too. And then finally, share. And this is regularly reflecting and sharing your experience with others, actively nurturing containers for psychological safety, being brave, because sharing honestly can take a lot of courage. Seems sometimes that things are really small, but if you're not used to this, just speaking up can really be big. And so celebrate those moments. And then also investing in systems and structures that foster the type of environment where empathy will thrive. So last thing is that practice makes progress. Right? I used to say practice makes perfect. I'm convinced I heard this from one of my kids' preschool teachers. They say that they heard it from me. I don't know where it came from. But flipping the idea that practice makes perfect. You will never be perfect with empathy. It doesn't exist. You can only know your own experience. There's no possible way that you could understand somebody else's experience completely, let alone, the billions of people who are on this planet. Not possible. So instead, forget about perfectionism. That's not the goal. The goal is continuous improvement, drawing a line in the sand and saying, I'm going to try to be a little bit better every day, and marginal gains. Because if everybody does a little bit better every day, we collectively can make a lot of progress really quickly, especially in our code bases and code quality. So a couple of key takeaways. You code for other people through a computer using empathy. Empathy is both emotion and it's logic. And there were a lot of historical events that impacted our identities, but we have the power to change those. We can change the narrative. You can absolutely grow your empathy skills with practice. And to do so, make sure you seek progress and not perfection. So with that, thank you. I'll take questions. You can sign up for book updates, empathyandtech.com. I'm semi-active on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm not somebody who's on there all the time, so forgive me if it takes a couple days to reply back. But yeah, so the book is called Empathy-Driven Software Development. It's going to be published by Pearson Addison Wesley, which has published a lot of other titles that I'm sure you've read. So I feel really honored. And yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with the manuscript. And if you sign up for updates, I'll be over the course of the next year while I'm writing it, trying to get feedback from other people. So if this is a topic that interests you, thank you so much. And Nicholas, I really appreciate being here.
Well, thank you very much. That was great, and I really like that because it's not a topic we discussed. I would say a lot, but not really at all. So thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So we have one question so far, which is a clarification request. Can you clarify the containers for psychological safety?
Yeah.
You have examples?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of times when we're on a team, right, like it can be hard to feel like you can share honestly without repercussion, right? So that's the definition of shame, right? Like being able to feel like you can be yourself without the fear, right? Or shame is the fear of being unworthy, unloved, or that you don't belong, right? And so if you are navigating in a world where there is a lot of shame, and in the software industry there is a lot of shame, being able to create spaces that are agreed to be as shame free as possible, right? And where you can have these kind of more vulnerable conversations and you can speak up without fear of retribution, of being put down or ignored or shamed. And a lot of times these happen in one-on-one relationships. Like Scott and I have worked really hard to develop a rapport of psychological safety. This comes with a lot of trust. You can do this on a team with a few people. You can try to create kind of a culture of that at different organizations. But the container is kind of the group, and it's the set of kind of rules. So agile coaches, a lot of times, that's the first thing they'll do is say, okay, in this space for the next few hours while we do a retrospective, these are the ground rules, and here's how we're going to operate. And that practice is called creating a container. So if there are relationships with people, or whether in the office or in your personal life, being able to kind of assess and say, okay, we're gonna work on this together, and I'm gonna try to learn from you, and I'm gonna mess up, and I'm gonna but hold me accountable when I trip up. Those kinds of places are the places where you want to focus on. So
Yeah, and it's something you can. So if you're looking for something to do in your team, this is something you can also bring, because legacy code base and also legacy environment. And I don't know where you're working on, but you, as you said, you cannot change everything overnight and make it perfect, etc. Progress matters.
yeah, I
So,
always suggest starting with yourself, because you
mhm.
don't have to do any extra research on your own experience. So you can start by creating a psychological safe place in yourself, right? Which is giving yourself permission to mess up and giving yourself compassion when you do. And that alone can be a profound practice, right? So kind of noticing, how are you shaming yourself? How are you telling yourself, um, like, and there's a difference, the research shows, between guilt and shame. So guilt is, I did something that I'm not proud of, right? I have a behavior or a value and I didn't live up to this standard that I have. That's actually really good. But you have shame, which is, I am bad. I am not enough. And that actually leads to depression, bullying, addiction, all of these negative outcomes. So one thing you can do as well is you can learn to notice shame-based language, like, oh, I'm such an idiot. Catch yourself and go, wait, okay, I'm not an idiot. I don't have as much experience as this person next to me. We take a deep breath, right? And so, like, switching that language from shame language to guilt language, and you do not need permission from anybody else to change your internal dialogue. So if you're looking for a place that you can start immediately, that's the place I always recommend.
That's a great advice. Well, thank you very much. All right, there is no other question, and we're gonna take a break. So we'll take a 10-minute break. Thank you very much, Andrea, for this. And yeah, if you want to connect with Andrea, so she is busy. She is really busy these days, but you can subscribe to her newsletter for the book, and also you will find her in the Legacy Cloud Rocks community. So I shared the link also in the chat. So you can join. Many people who are in the audience actually also are in the community, so you can find us here. All right, so 10-minute break, and then we will have Amitai, who will be sharing his own experience also. Working with code bases and like a you will see, but it's a very interesting talk of Amitai sharing his personal experience on this. Thank you very much.